The emergency broadcast came through at 0400 hours and woke everyone in the council chambers. Peter Grant had been asleep in his quarters when the alarm started screaming. He ran down the corridor in his uniform pants and an undershirt while trying to fasten his boots. Other ambassadors were doing the same thing. Everyone looked confused and scared. The Vexthor were coming. That was all the message said. The Vexthor were coming, and the council needed to meet immediately. Peter made it to the chamber and took his seat at the human delegation table. The room filled quickly with representatives from 200 different species. Some had scales, some had fur. Some looked almost human while others were barely recognizable as living creatures. But they all wore the same expression now. Fear. Pure fear. The head counselor stood at the center podium and began speaking in the common trade language. His words were simple and direct. The Vexthor had crossed the galactic rim 3 days ago, with a fleet larger than anything in recorded history. They were moving through the outer territories and destroying everything in their path. No communications, no demands, just destruction. Peter listened as the counselor explained the strategic situation. The Vexthor were heading toward the core worlds along several different routes. The council military was mobilizing, but it would take weeks to assemble a proper defensive force. They needed to buy time. They needed someone to hold key positions throughout the galaxy, while the main fleet gathered. The counselor looked around the room. Every species would need to contribute. Every member would need to send their forces to defend strategic choke points. Peter stood up when the counselor asked for volunteers. His hand went up before he could think about it. Earth would defend the Sigma Corridor. It was one of the most dangerous positions. A narrow passage between two nebulae that the Vexthor would certainly use. If someone could hold it for even a few weeks, the council would have time to prepare. The counselor looked at Peter with something like surprise. Then he nodded. Humanity's offer was accepted. The meeting ended 2 hours later, and Peter immediately sent messages back to Earth. He explained the situation to the military command. Admiral Daniel Cross responded within an hour. He would take 70% of Earth's fleet to the Sigma Corridor. It was a huge commitment, but Peter had not given them much choice. The ambassador had volunteered humanity without asking permission first. Daniel did not complain, though. He just asked for 48 hours to assemble the ships and crews. Kate Morrison received her orders while the Phoenix Dawn was docked at Luna Station for routine maintenance. She read the message 3 times to make sure she understood correctly. Her carrier was being assigned to the Sigma Corridor Defense Force under Admiral Cross. Expected enemy contact in 6 days. Likelihood of survival rated at 40%. She called her senior officers to the bridge and told them the news. Some of them looked worried. A few looked excited. Most just looked determined. They had trained for this. They had joined the fleet knowing that someday they might face real combat. Now that day had come. The human fleet assembled faster than anyone expected. Ships came from Earth orbit, from Mars, from the asteroid belt stations, from the outer colonies near Jupiter and Saturn. 70 warships in total, including carriers and destroyers and frigates and support vessels. It was not a large force by galactic standards, but it was everything humanity could spare. Admiral Cross took command from his flagship stationed at the center of the formation. He sent out final checks to all ships. Everyone reported ready. They jumped to the Sigma Corridor 3 days later. The passage was exactly as the map showed. 2 massive nebulae on either side created a relatively clear channel about 2 light hours wide. Perfect for a fleet trying to move quickly toward the core worlds. Perfect for an ambush too if someone was willing to stay and fight. Admiral Cross ordered the fleet to take defensive positions. They spread out across the corridor and began setting up sensor networks and weapons platforms. They had 6 days before the Vexthor arrived. Maybe less. Kate spent those 6 days preparing her pilots. Jake Russell was one of her best. Young but skilled. Aggressive but not stupid. She put him in charge of the lead fighter squadron. He accepted the responsibility without hesitation. She liked that about him. No false modesty, no unnecessary questions, just a simple acknowledgement and a promise to do his job. She needed more officers like that. The Vexthor arrived early. Admiral Cross got the sensor warning with 4 days left on his preparation timeline. The enemy fleet was massive. Hundreds of capital ships, thousands of smaller vessels. They moved in a tight formation like a wall of metal and weapons. Cross watched the sensor displays and calculated the odds. They were bad, very bad. But he had volunteered for this position. Humanity had volunteered. There was no backing out now. The first engagement lasted 6 hours. Human ships used the nebulae for cover and struck at the edges of the Vexthor formation. They destroyed a dozen enemy vessels before retreating. The Vexthor pursued, but their larger ships could not maneuver well in the confined space. Cross ordered his forces to hit and run. Never stay in one place. Never let the enemy bring their full firepower to bear. It was working, but barely. They lost 3 destroyers in that first fight. The Phoenix Dawn took heavy damage to its port side. Days turned into weeks. The human fleet held the corridor through constant fighting. They slept in shifts. They ate rations at their stations. They patched damage with whatever materials they could find. Jake Russell flew 4 sorties every day. He lost wingmen on every mission. Kate Morrison commanded the Phoenix Dawn from a bridge that smelled like burned electronics and recycled air. Admiral Cross coordinated the defense from a flagship that had taken so much damage it could barely move. On the 18th day, Peter Grant received a message from the Council. It was marked urgent and came through on a secure channel. He opened it expecting news about reinforcements. Instead, he read 3 paragraphs that made his blood run cold. The Council had reviewed the strategic situation. The Sigma Corridor was holding, but at great cost. Humanity had lost almost half their fleet. The Vexthor were still pushing forward, and the Council had made a decision. Earth's homeworld was far from the galactic core. Defending it would require resources that could be better used protecting more central systems. The Council had voted. Humanity was hereby expelled from the Alliance effective immediately. All human forces were ordered to withdraw from Council space or be treated as hostile vessels. The message included a brief apology. These were difficult times. Difficult decisions had to be made. The galaxy must survive. Peter read the message again, then a 3rd time. He could not believe what he was seeing. Humanity had held the Sigma Corridor for 18 days. They had lost thousands of personnel. They had bled for the Council, and now they were being abandoned. Cast aside because Earth was not strategically important enough. He stood up from his desk and walked to the window. Outside, he could see the Council towers stretching into the sky. Beautiful buildings, gleaming metal and crystal, built by the cooperation of 200 species working together. All of it suddenly felt like a lie. Admiral Cross received the same message 30 minutes later. He was coordinating the evacuation of a damaged destroyer when the communication came through. He read it once and then forwarded it to all ships in the fleet. No commentary, no orders yet, just the raw message. He wanted his people to see exactly what the Council had decided. He wanted them to understand what humanity meant to these species they had been fighting for. Kate Morrison was on the bridge when the message arrived. She read it and felt something break inside her chest, not her spirit, her illusions. She had believed in the Council, believed in the Alliance, believed that standing together meant something. Now she understood the truth. The Council stood together only when it was convenient, only when it was profitable, only when members were valuable enough to defend. Humanity had just learned they were not valuable enough. The fleet held position for another 6 hours while Admiral Cross considered his options. The Vexthor were still pressing forward. The human ships were battered and exhausted. Cross could order a retreat, get his people out of the corridor and back toward Earth, or he could stay and keep fighting for a Council that had just abandoned them. Neither option felt right, but staying felt worse. He gave the order. All ships prepare to withdraw. They were going home. The withdrawal took 3 days. Human forces pulled back from their positions in careful stages. The Vexthor pursued, but not aggressively. They seemed content to let the humans go. Maybe they respected an enemy who had fought so hard. Maybe they just did not care. Either way, the human fleet made it out of the Sigma Corridor with minimal additional losses. They jumped toward Sol System and left the Council to its fate. Peter Grant remained at the Council chambers long enough to file formal protests. He demanded to speak with the head counselor. He was denied. He demanded explanations. He was told the decision was final. He demanded at least acknowledgement of humanity's sacrifice. He was given a form letter thanking Earth for its service. On the 4th day after receiving the expulsion notice, Peter packed his belongings and left. He did not say goodbye to any of the other ambassadors. He did not attend any Finn. The debate started 3 hours after the fleet returned to Earth orbit, and it did not stop for 72 hours straight. Every government official had an opinion. Every military commander had a plan. Every scientist had a theory. They gathered in the emergency command center deep beneath Geneva and argued while the clock counted down to extinction. Peter Grant sat at the ambassador's table and listened to people panic. Some wanted to evacuate, load every colony ship with civilians, and flee into deep space. Others wanted to surrender, send a message to the Vexthor and hope they would show mercy. A few wanted to fight but had no idea how. Admiral Daniel Cross stood up on the second day and demanded silence. He had run the numbers a dozen times. With current resources, Earth could delay the Vexthor for maybe 6 weeks. That was the best-case scenario. More likely they would fall in 3 or 4 weeks. 6 weeks was not enough time to evacuate even 1% of Earth's population. Running was not an option unless they wanted to abandon 8 billion people to certain death. Surrender was pointless because the Vexthor had never negotiated with anyone. They just destroyed. So that left fighting with everything they had and hoping it would be enough. Peter stood next and his voice was quiet, but everyone heard him anyway. The council had walked away because they thought humanity was expendable. They thought humans were weak. They thought Earth was not worth defending. Maybe it was time to prove them wrong. Maybe it was time to show the galaxy what humans were capable of when they had nothing left to lose. He sat down and nobody spoke for a long minute. Then Kate Morrison stood up. Kate had spent the past 2 days analyzing every piece of combat data from the Sigma corridor. She had watched recordings of Vexthor attack patterns. She had studied their ship designs. She had reviewed their tactics in 100 different engagements. And she had found something interesting. The Vexthor were powerful, but they were predictable. They relied on overwhelming force and superior technology. They used the same formations, the same approach vectors, the same strategies every single time. That was a weakness. That could be exploited. She explained her observations to the room. The Vexthor had never faced an opponent desperate enough to try truly unconventional warfare. Every species they fought used standard military doctrine. Fleet engagements, formation battles, controlled tactical withdrawals. But what if humanity threw out all those rules? What if they fought dirty? What if they used tactics that no civilized species would consider? Suicide runs, kamikaze attacks, weapons that violated every treaty, strategies that prioritized maximum damage over survival. The Vexthor would not be prepared for that. The room erupted in arguments immediately. Half the people called Kate insane. The casualty rates would be horrific. The tactics were barbaric. The weapons she was suggesting were banned by the council for good reasons. Peter waited for the shouting to die down, and then he asked a simple question. Did anyone have a better plan? Nobody answered. Kate sat down and crossed her arms. Admiral Cross looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. It might work. It probably would not, but it might. And that was better than certain extinction. Lisa Chen entered the room on the third day of debate carrying a tablet full of classified research files. She was the head of something called the Human Research Initiative. Most people in the room had never heard of it. That was by design. Her team worked on projects the council would never approve. Dangerous projects. Reckless projects. Projects that pushed the boundaries of ethics and safety. One of those projects was called Wildfire. Lisa explained Wildfire in simple terms. They had been developing ways to weaponize civilian infrastructure. Fusion reactors could be turned into massive bombs. Colony ships could be converted into kamikaze vessels. Automated systems could control drone swarms numbering in the millions. Artificial intelligence could coordinate attacks faster than any organic crew. All of it violated council regulations. All of it was technically ready to deploy. All of it required resources that Earth would need for survival. But if they were going to die anyway, they might as well take the Vexthor with them. The debate shifted after that. Now they were not arguing about whether to fight, but how to fight. Lisa laid out her proposals. Admiral Cross added tactical modifications. Kate suggested deployment strategies. Peter coordinated with civilian authorities about resource allocation. Slowly a plan emerged. It was insane and desperate and would probably kill millions of humans even if it worked. But it was a plan. It was something they could actually do. Jake Russell volunteered to lead the fighter wings before anyone even asked. He was still recovering from injuries sustained at the Sigma corridor. His left arm was in a brace. His ribs were cracked. The doctors said he needed at least 6 more weeks before he could fly combat missions. He told them he would be in a cockpit in 3 days regardless of what they recommended. When Admiral Cross asked him why he would risk his life for such a desperate plan, Jake just shrugged. Because the Council walked away, because humanity had nothing left to lose, because running had never been the human way. Earth mobilized faster than anyone thought possible. Every factory retooled for war production. Every shipyard worked 24-hour shifts. Every research facility focused on weapons development. Civilian volunteers by the thousands signed up for military training. People who had never fired a weapon learned to operate point defense systems. Scientists who had spent their lives studying peaceful applications of fusion learned to build bombs. Engineers who designed colony ships learned to convert them into missiles. The moon became a massive construction zone. New defensive platforms rose from the surface like steel trees. Weapons batteries appeared in craters that had been empty for millions of years. Launch facilities for drone swarms covered entire regions. Kate Morrison personally oversaw the conversion of 6 colony transports into carrier vessels. They were crude and ugly and would probably fall apart under heavy combat, but they could launch fighters. That was all that mattered. Admiral Cross coordinated with commanders throughout the solar system. Mars became a forward base. The asteroid belt became a weapons depot. Jupiter's moons housed backup command centers. Saturn's rings hid emergency supply caches. Neptune's orbit marked the outer defensive perimeter. Every planet, every moon, every significant asteroid, all of it was incorporated into the defense network. When the Vexthor came, they would not face a single fortress. They would face an entire solar system turned into a weapon. Lisa pushed her teams past every safety limit. They tested weapons that should have taken years to develop. They deployed systems that had never been properly validated. They took risks that made even military commanders nervous. 3 researchers died in testing accidents. A dozen more were injured. Lisa attended every funeral and then went back to the laboratory. She did not have time for grief. None of them did. The Vexthor were coming and Earth needed weapons. Peter sent one final message to the Council 3 weeks into the mobilization. It was not a request for help. It was not a plea for mercy. It was a statement. Humanity remembered who stood with them and who walked away. Earth would face the Vexthor alone. If humanity fell, the Council would have to live with that choice. But if Earth survived, the galaxy would know that humans did not abandon their own. The message was brief and formal. Peter did not expect a response. He did not get one. The Vexthor fleet entered the outer solar system exactly 4 weeks after the human fleet returned from Sigma Corridor. The sensor arrays detected them at the edge of Neptune's orbit. Admiral Cross read the initial reports and felt his stomach drop. Over 3,000 capital ships, tens of thousands of smaller vessels, a fleet 10 times larger than the one that had shattered Council defenses across the galaxy. The computer calculated the odds of Earth's survival. 0.03%. Essentially, Zero Cross stood in the command center and looked at the tactical displays. Red markers representing enemy ships filled the screen like a crimson tide. Blue markers representing human forces were scattered across the solar system. Less than 400 operational ships, most of them damaged from the Sigma Corridor. Most of them crewed by exhausted personnel who had not slept properly in weeks. Behind them, Earth hung in space. 8 billion people. One planet. The only home humanity had ever known. He opened a channel to all human forces. Every ship, every station, every defense platform, every fighter squadron, every person who had volunteered to stand between Earth and extinction. His message was simple. The Vexthor were here. The odds were impossible. Most of them would probably die. But they would make the enemy pay for every single meter of space. They would fight with everything they had. They would show the Vexthor and the Council and the entire galaxy what humans were capable of. They would make this a battle that would be remembered for 1,000 years. Kate Morrison stood on the bridge of the remembrance. They had renamed the Phoenix Dawn after repairs, a memorial to those who died at Sigma Corridor. She looked at her crew. Young faces, scared faces, determined faces. They had all volunteered for this. They had all known what they were signing up for. She told them to get to their stations, to do their jobs, to trust their training, and to remember that they were fighting for everything who. The Vexthor came in their standard formation, and that was their first mistake. They advanced like a wall of metal and weapons, just like they had at every other battle in their invasion. thousands of capital ships arranged in precise geometric patterns, smaller vessels filling the gaps between larger ones, point defense systems interlocked for maximum coverage. It was efficient and powerful and completely predictable. Admiral Cross watched them approach and smiled for the first time in weeks. They were playing by the rules. Humanity was about to break every rule in existence. Lisa Chen activated Project Wildfire when the enemy fleet crossed Neptune's orbit. 3 million autonomous drones emerged from hidden positions throughout the asteroid belt. Each one carried a single nuclear warhead. Each one had basic navigation and targeting systems. Each one cost less than a standard missile. The Council would have called them primitive, wasteful, inefficient. Lisa called them perfect for this situation. The Vex-Thor point defense systems were designed to intercept missiles and torpedoes. They were not designed to handle 3 million individual targets. The drones swarmed the Vex-Thor fleet like angry insects. Their point defense systems fired continuously. They destroyed thousands of drones, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. But there were millions more. The drones did not care about tactics. They did not care about formation. They just flew straight at the nearest enemy ship and detonated. Nuclear fire bloomed across the Vex-Thor formation. Shields failed. Armor cracked. Ships tumbled out of position, trailing atmosphere and debris. Kate Morrison led the Remembrance into the chaos. Her orders were specific and suicidal. Get close to the enemy, closer than any sane commander would risk. Close enough that the Vex-Thor could not use their heavy weapons without hitting their own ships. Then detonate the fusion reactor. The Remembrance's crew had already evacuated to escape pods. Only Kate and a skeleton team remained on board. She piloted the massive carrier through a storm of weapons, fire, while her engineer prepped the reactor for overload. They made it to within 2 kilometers of a Vex-Thor dreadnought before the enemy realized what was happening. By then it was too late. Kate ordered the final evacuation. Her remaining crew ran for the pods. Her engineer stayed behind to make sure the reactor went critical. Kate stayed behind because she was the captain. She watched her crew escape. Then she set the timer for 30 seconds and climbed into the last pod. The Remembrance detonated 8 seconds later. Kate's pod tumbled through the explosion. The blast killed 17 Vex-Thor capital ships. Kate survived with a concussion and second-degree burns. Jake Russell led his fighter squadrons into the heart of the enemy formation. They had one job: find the reactor cores and engine clusters on Vex-Thor ships and destroy them. It did not matter that fighters were not designed for this kind of work. It did not matter that the targets were heavily defended. It did not matter that most of his pilots would not survive. Jake flew through point defense fire that turned space into a web of energy beams and projectiles. Half his squadron died in the first minute. He kept flying. His targeting computer identified a vulnerable spot on a Vex-Thor cruiser, a coolant port leading directly to the reactor chamber. Jake dove toward it while his wingman drew defensive fire. He launched his entire payload into the port and pulled up hard. The explosion tore the cruiser in half. Jake's fighter took damage from debris. His left engine failed. His shields were gone. He barely made it back to the nearest human carrier. 48 fighters had launched with him. 19 returned. Jake volunteered for the next sortie before his fighter was even repaired. The Vex-Thor adapted after the first day. They tightened their formations. They increased point defense coverage. They deployed their own fighter screens. But humanity adapted faster. Human ships started using asteroids as improvised weapons. They attached engines to rocks the size of buildings and accelerated them to relativistic speeds. The Vex-Thor could not shoot down a mountain moving at a significant fraction of light speed. When those asteroids hit, they hit with the force of nuclear weapons. Lisa deployed her second weapon system on day 3. Computer viruses designed to infiltrate Vex-Thor networks. They were crude programs that barely qualified as artificial intelligence. They violated a dozen council regulations about autonomous combat systems. They also worked better than anyone expected. Vex-Thor ships started targeting each other. Their navigation systems fed false data. Their weapons fired at random. Their formations dissolved into chaos as ships tried to avoid friendly fire. Admiral Cross coordinated the defense from his command station while tracking casualty reports that grew longer every hour. Earth had lost 100 ships in the first week, 200 ships in the second week. The Vex-Thor had lost over 800. By normal military calculations, that was a fantastic kill ratio. By survival calculations, it meant humanity was still losing. They could not sustain these losses. The Vexthor could. Math was cruel that way. The battle pushed past Jupiter, then past Mars. Human forces fell back toward Earth and the Vexthor pursued. But something was changing. The enemy advance was slower now, more cautious. They had expected easy victory. They had encountered an opponent who refused to die, who used tactics no civilized species would consider, who sacrificed ships and lives with abandon if it meant killing more enemies. The Vexthor had never faced anything like this. They did not know how to respond. Kate took command of a destroyer after the Remembrance was destroyed. Then she took command of a frigate after the destroyer was lost. Then she commanded a patrol boat when the frigate died. She kept fighting with whatever ship was available. Her crews kept following her because she never asked them to do anything she would not do herself. When she ordered a suicide run, she led it personally. When she ordered retreat, she covered the withdrawal. Her people knew she would die before she abandoned them. Jake flew 8 sorties a day. His squadron rotated pilots as they were killed or injured, but Jake never stopped. He slept in his cockpit between missions. He ate ration bars while reviewing tactical data. His flight suit had not been off his body in 2 weeks. The flight surgeons tried to ground him. Admiral Cross overruled them. The human forces needed every experienced pilot they had. Jake was the best. So Jake kept flying. Lisa worked in her laboratory while the battle raged overhead. She developed new weapons every day. Some worked. Some failed catastrophically. She sent anything functional straight to the fleet without proper testing. There was no time for testing. The Vexthor were at Mars. Then they were at Luna. Then they were in Earth orbit. Lisa's lab took a direct hit on day 37. She and her team evacuated to an underground facility and kept working. Peter watched the battle from command centers that kept changing as facilities were destroyed. He had no military role now. His job as ambassador was meaningless when there was no one to negotiate with. But he stayed anyway. He coordinated civilian evacuations. He managed resource distribution. He kept communication networks running. He made sure the people fighting in space knew that Earth had not given up, that humanity had not quit, that the Council had walked away but humans walked into the fire. On day 40, the Vexthor committed their command ship. A dreadnought 3 times the size of any human vessel. It moved into Earth orbit surrounded by escorts and began coordinating the final assault. Admiral Cross saw the opportunity immediately. The Vexthor had made a mistake. They had put their leadership in a position where humanity could reach it. Cross sent orders to every remaining ship, every fighter squadron, every weapons platform, everything they had left. One final attack, one last desperate gamble. Kill the command ship or die trying. Human forces converged from across the solar system, ships held together by emergency welds, fighters with damaged engines, weapons platforms running on backup power. They all came because Admiral Cross had given the order. Because this was their last chance. Because Earth was hours away from falling and they had nothing left to lose. The Vexthor escort fleet tried to stop them. They destroyed dozens of human ships, hundreds of fighters. It did not matter. The rest kept coming. Jake Russell led the final fighter assault. His orders were simple. Get through the shields. Get to the bridge. Deliver the payload. His payload was Lisa's last weapon. A computer virus specifically designed to target Vexthor command systems. It was uploaded to a data core attached to his fighter's hull. All he had to do was ram the bridge and hope the virus could transmit before the explosion destroyed everything. It was a suicide mission. Jake volunteered before anyone asked. He flew through a storm of defensive fire. His shields failed. His weapons were destroyed. His engines were hit and started leaking fuel. But he kept flying. The bridge of the Vexthor dreadnought filled his canopy. He could see through the viewport. Could see the alien commanders directing their fleet. Could see them realize what was about to happen. Jake set the fighter on collision course. Then he ejected at the last possible second. The fighter crashed through the bridge viewport and detonated inside the command center. The virus transmitted in the microseconds before the explosion consumed everything. It spread through the dreadnought's computer networks. Then it jumped to every connected ship in the Vexthor fleet. Kong. The silence after the battle was worse than the fighting. Admiral Cross stood in the command center and looked at the casualty reports. 8 billion people had lived on Earth before the war. Now 6 billion remained. 2 billion dead in 43 days. Most cities on the surface were damaged or destroyed. The orbital infrastructure was gone. Luna was scarred by impacts. Mars was a wasteland. The fleet was reduced to 47 operational ships. Everything humanity had built in space over 200 years was destroyed. Cross broadcast the victory message to Earth. His voice was steady, but he felt nothing inside except exhaustion. They had won. Humanity had survived. The Vexthor were retreating. But the cost was so terrible that victory felt hollow. He could hear people celebrating in some parts of the command center. Others were crying. Most just sat in silence trying to process what had happened. Cross finished his message and turned off the microphone. Then he sat down and put his head in his hands. Peter walked through the ruins of Geneva 3 days after the battle ended. The Council Embassy building was gone. A Vexthor kinetic strike had hit it during the final assault. The entire district was flattened. Bodies were still being pulled from the rubble. Peter had known people who worked in this area. Friends, colleagues, people he had shared meals with while discussing trade agreements and diplomatic protocols. Now they were all dead because the Council had decided Earth was not worth defending. He found what remained of his old office. The desk was crushed under tons of concrete. His files were scattered and burned. The picture of his family was somehow intact in the debris. Peter picked it up and wiped away the dust. His wife and daughter had evacuated to the underground shelters. They had survived. Millions of others had not. Peter stood among the ruins and thought about the Council, about their pragmatism, about their calculations, about how they had decided some lives were worth saving and others were not. Kate was recovered from her escape pod 4 days after the battle. She had been drifting in space with a failing life support system. Her pod was damaged. Her suit was leaking air. By the time the rescue ship found her, she was unconscious and hypothermic. They brought her back to a medical station and spent 2 days warming her up. When she finally woke up, the first thing she asked about was her crew. They told her most had survived. The Remembrance's evacuation procedures had worked. 70% of her people made it to the pods before the reactor exploded. Kate spent the next week in recovery. Her body had burns from the explosion. Her lungs were damaged from breathing thin air. Her mind kept replaying the moment she set the reactor to overload. She had killed 17 enemy ships. She had saved thousands of human lives by removing those ships from the battle. But she had also destroyed the Remembrance, the ship she had commanded for 5 years. The ship that had been her home. She cried about that more than she cried about her injuries. Lisa sat in the wreckage of her laboratory and looked at the casualty reports from her research teams. 43 scientists dead, 96 injured. Her weapons had worked. Project Wildfire had killed thousands of Vexthor ships. The computer viruses had crippled their command structure. The drone swarms had overwhelmed their defenses. Everything she had built in 4 desperate weeks had performed beyond expectations. But it had not been enough to prevent billions of deaths. Lisa wondered if anything would have been enough. Jake spent 2 weeks in medical recovery. His ejection from the fighter had broken 3 ribs and dislocated his shoulder. His suit had been leaking air for the 20 minutes he was unconscious in the pod. The doctor said he was lucky to be alive. Jake did not feel lucky. He felt tired. He had flown 96 combat sorties in 43 days. He had seen hundreds of pilots die. His best friend had been killed on day 12. His former instructor had died on day 30. Jake had survived when better pilots had not, and he did not know why. News of Earth's survival spread through Council space faster than anyone expected. The species that had abandoned humanity watched recordings of the battle. They saw human ships deliberately crash into enemy vessels. They saw fighters making suicide runs. They saw weapons that violated every treaty. They saw tactics that no rational military would consider. They saw an entire civilization refuse to surrender even when extinction was certain. The Council military analysts studied the data for weeks. By their calculations, Earth should have fallen in days. Some Council members sent messages of congratulation. Others sent messages of horror. A few sent messages expressing fear. Earth had defeated an enemy that destroyed Council fleets with ease. Earth had done it using tactics that terrified civilized species. What would humanity do with that power? What would they do with that fury? The Council had walked away from Earth. Now Earth had proven they did not need the Council. That was a dangerous shift in the galactic balance of power. The Zephany were the first species to reach out to humanity directly. Their homeworld had fallen to the Vexthor 3 years earlier. They had evacuated what population they could and scattered across Council space as refugees. The Zephani ambassador sent a personal message to Peter. They had watched Earth's battle. They had seen humanity fight for 43 days. The Zephani had fought for 6 days before their government surrendered. They wished they had been as brave. They wished they had fought as hard. They envied humanity's victory and mourned their own cowardice. Peter read the message 3 times. The Zephani were not offering alliance. They were not asking for anything. They were just acknowledging what had happened. They understood what it meant to be abandoned. They understood what it meant to lose everything. They understood that the Council's pragmatism was just cowardice dressed up in strategic language. Peter wrote a response. It was brief. Earth remembered the Zephani. Earth would not forget who had the courage to speak honestly. That might matter someday. The Council sent official communications 2 weeks after the battle ended. They congratulated Earth on the victory. They expressed relief that humanity had survived. They offered immediate readmission to the Alliance. They claimed the expulsion had been a temporary strategic decision. They said it had always been intended to be reversed once the immediate crisis passed. They offered trade agreements, technology exchanges, military cooperation. They wanted access to Project Wildfire. They wanted human military advisors. They wanted the weapons and tactics that had defeated the Vexthor. Peter read the messages with cold fury. Admiral Cross recommended rejecting everything outright. Kate suggested taking a fleet to Council space and demonstrating exactly what human weapons could do. Lisa just deleted half the communication requests without reading them. They met in what remained of the Geneva Command Center to discuss Earth's response. The room was still damaged. The walls were cracked. The ceiling had temporary patches, but it was functional, like humanity itself. Jake attended the meeting as the newly promoted Commander Russell. He listened to the others debate what to do. Peter wanted to reject the Council completely. Cross wanted to make demands. Kate wanted revenge. Lisa wanted isolation. Everyone had strong opinions. Everyone was angry. Jake understood that anger. He felt it too, but he also remembered something. He remembered the Zephani refugees he had helped evacuate. He remembered the species who had lost their homeworlds because the Council decided they were not worth defending. Jake spoke up for the first time in the meeting. The Council had betrayed Earth, that was true. The pain of that betrayal would never fully heal. That was also true. But humanity had learned something important through that betrayal. They had learned what abandonment felt like. They had learned the cost of being written off as expendable. They had learned that pragmatism was just a way to avoid hard choices. If Earth rejected the Council completely, they would be alone. If Earth took revenge, they would become what they hated. But if Earth chose differently, they could change things. The room was silent after Jake finished speaking. Peter looked at him for a long moment. Cross frowned. Kate crossed her arms. Lisa tapped her fingers on the table. Nobody spoke for almost a minute. Then Peter asked a simple question. What would choosing differently look like? Jake did not have a perfect answer, but he had an idea. Earth could accept refugees from species the Council had abandoned. Earth could defend worlds that were not strategically important. Earth could prove that some things mattered more than pragmatism. They could show the galaxy what it meant to not walk away. Admiral Cross was the first to nod. Then Kate, then Lisa. Peter sat quietly and thought about it. Jake's proposal was idealistic, maybe naive. It would not undo the Council's betrayal. It would not bring back the 2 billion dead. But it would mean something. It would mean that Earth had not become bitter and vengeful. It would mean humanity had learned from their pain instead of being consumed by it. Peter finally nodded. They would accept refugees. They would help the abandoned. But on Earth's terms, not the Council's. The first refugee ships arrived 3 months after the battle. They came from species whose worlds had fallen to the Vexthor. People who had nowhere else to go. People the Council had decided were not worth saving. Earth was still rebuilding. Resources were scarce. Housing was limited. But humanity made room. They built new settlements. They shared food. 5 years passed and Earth was transformed. The cities were rebuilt but different, stronger, more defensible. The orbital infrastructure was restored but improved. New weapons platforms, better sensors, faster response systems. The fleet had grown to 200 ships. Small by council standards, but every vessel was crewed by people who understood what it meant to fight for survival. Admiral Cross commanded the defense forces from a new flagship. He was older now, gray hair, lines around his eyes. But his determination had not faded. Kate commanded a carrier group that patrolled the outer territories. Not council space. The regions the council had abandoned. Places where refugee populations tried to rebuild. Where pirates and raiders preyed on the weak. Where the Vexthor still launched occasional attacks. Kate's ships arrived when no one else would. They defended worlds that were not strategically important. They protected people who could not protect themselves. Her crews were mixed, human, Zephany, a dozen other species, all united by the memory of being abandoned. Lisa ran a research network that spanned Earth and 3 refugee colonies. Her teams developed technology for defense and reconstruction. They shared everything freely. No patents, no profit motives, just science for the sake of helping people survive. The council offered her positions, high-paying jobs, access to advanced facilities. She turned them all down. Her work was not for sale. It was for the people who needed it most. The people the council had written off. Jake served as humanity's liaison to refugee populations. He spent most of his time traveling between settlements, helping communities organize, training local defense forces, coordinating resource distribution. He had become something unexpected after the war. Not just a fighter pilot, a bridge between species, someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and keep going. The refugees trusted him because he had been there. He had fought when defeat seemed certain. He had survived when survival seemed impossible. Peter remained Earth's primary diplomat, but his role had changed. He no longer sought council approval. He no longer negotiated for membership or status. Instead, he built networks with the forgotten species, the abandoned worlds, the populations the council had decided were expendable. Earth's alliance grew slowly but steadily, not through military force, through shared experience, through the simple act of not walking away when things got difficult. The Vexthor launched a new offensive in the 5th year. This time they targeted council core worlds. Suddenly, the species that had abandoned Earth remembered humanity's victory. They remembered the weapons, the tactics, the desperate courage. They sent messages to Peter, urgent requests, pleas for assistance, offers of alliance. They needed Earth's help. They needed Project Wildfire. They needed human military advisors. They were willing to pay anything, promise anything, do anything. Peter read the messages in his office overlooking the rebuilt Geneva. The council towers had been reconstructed, but Earth had not rebuilt their embassy there. The space was now a memorial, a reminder. Peter forwarded the council's requests to the military command, to the civilian government, to the refugee alliance. Everyone had opinions. Some wanted revenge, let the council face the same abandonment they had inflicted. Some saw opportunity, extract massive concessions in exchange for help. Some advocated principle, help because it was right regardless of the past. Earth's government debated for 2 weeks. The arguments were heated, emotional. 5 years had not erased the memory of betrayal. 2 billion dead were not forgotten. The council's pragmatism had cost humanity everything. Why should Earth help them now? Why should humans die for species that had calculated Earth was not worth defending? Why should they walk into the fire again for people who had walked away? Admiral Cross attended the debates but rarely spoke. When he finally stood up, the room went quiet. He explained the military situation. The Vexthor offensive was massive. Council forces were retreating. Core worlds were evacuating. The same pattern as before. The same species making the same calculations, deciding which worlds were worth defending, which populations were worth saving. Cross said Earth could let that happen. They could watch the council suffer. Or they could prove something different. Jake spoke next. He was not a politician, not a diplomat, just a pilot who had flown too many missions and seen too many friends die, but he understood something the others seemed to miss. The council had abandoned Earth because they calculated human lives were not valuable enough. If Earth abandoned the council now for the same reason, then humanity would become exactly what they hated. The betrayal would be complete, not because the council had walked away, because Earth had learned to walk away too. Peter listened to the debates and thought about the past 5 years. Earth had accepted refugees. Earth had defended abandoned worlds. Earth had shared technology. Earth had built alliances based on principle instead of pragmatism. All of that would be meaningless if they turned their backs now. The Council did not deserve help. But the civilians on those core worlds did, the people who had no say in their government's decisions, the ones who would die while their leaders calculated strategic value. Earth had to be better than the Council. That was the only way any of this mattered. The vote was close. 48% wanted to refuse. 42% wanted to help. 10% wanted to extract concessions first. Peter broke the deadlock. Earth would assist. Not because the Council asked. Not because of treaties or trade agreements, but because 5 years ago humanity learned what abandonment felt like. Earth would never inflict that on others, not even species that had abandoned them. Human forces would deploy to defend Council worlds, but on humanity's terms. Not the Council's. Admiral Cross delivered Earth's response to the Council personally. He stood before the full assembly and spoke without notes. Earth would send military forces. Earth would deploy defensive technology. Earth would share the tactics that had defeated the Vexthor at Sol. But Earth would not rejoin the Council. Earth would not accept subordinate status. Earth would not pretend the past 5 years had not happened. The Council had made a choice. Now they would live with the consequences of that choice. The terms were simple. Human forces would fight where the fighting was hardest, where casualties were highest, where other species refused to commit. Earth would take the positions everyone else abandoned. They would defend the worlds the Council deemed not strategically important. They would walk into the fire because that was what humans did. But in return, the Council would change. No more calculated abandonments. No more strategic decisions about which species deserved defense. No more walking away. Ever. The Council agreed because they had no choice. The Vexthor were at their core worlds. Their fleets were retreating. Their defenses were failing. They needed Earth, they needed human weapons. They needed human tactics. They needed the species they had abandoned 5 years ago. Cross made them vote on the new protocols. Make it official. Make it binding. No species would be expelled for strategic reasons. No worlds would be written off as expendable. The vote was unanimous. Fear was a powerful motivator. Human fleets deployed across Council space within days. Kate led a battle group to defend a border world the Council had already evacuated. The local population had refused to leave. They had nowhere else to go. Kate's ships arrived and established defensive positions. When the Vexthor attacked, they found Earth forces waiting. The battle lasted 3 weeks. Kate held the line until Council reinforcements finally arrived. She lost 2 ships. The planet survived. Jake coordinated civilian evacuations on a dozen worlds. The Council military had written these planets off. Too far, too expensive, too dangerous. Jake arrived with transport ships and fighter escorts. He pulled millions of people from war zones the Council had abandoned. Some were human. Most were not. Jake did not care. They needed help. That was all that mattered. He flew cover for evacuation ships while Vexthor fighters pursued. He lost pilots on every mission. They kept flying anyway. Lisa's defensive technology saved countless lives. Her shield systems protected refugee ships. Her sensor networks gave early warning of Vexthor attacks. Her medical equipment treated wounded from a dozen species. The Council military asked how much she wanted for the technology. She told them it was free. They did not understand. Everything had a price. Everything was a transaction. Lisa explained it in simple terms. Her people had died because the Council calculated Earth was not worth defending. She would not make that same calculation. Her technology was for anyone who needed it. No exceptions. Admiral Cross commanded the defense of 3 core worlds simultaneously. His forces were spread thin. His resources were limited. But he had learned from the Battle of Earth how to fight with less, how to turn desperation into advantage, how to win when losing seemed certain. The Vexthor hit his positions with overwhelming force. Cross responded with tactics no Council commander would use. Suicide runs, kamikaze attacks, weapons that violated treaties, the same desperate courage that had saved Earth 5 years ago. The Council watched in confusion. Human forces fought harder for Council worlds than Council forces did. Earth lost ships and personnel defending systems that were not theirs. Humans died protecting civilians from species that had abandoned humanity. It did not.